In English, we can arrange transitive verbs in different ways in a sentence. We can arrange them in what's called the active voice to emphasize that the subject performs an action that affects the object, or we can rearrange them in what's called the passive voice to emphasize that the object receives the action. And there's some very specific changes that we make in order to do this in our language. So let's take a look at an active verb. I broke the vase. We're going to let it be the simple past tense. Voice is independent of tense. Voice can happen in active or passive voice can be used in any tense in English. And remember here that when I'm saying active, I'm not talking about the fact that breaking is an action as opposed to, say, a linking verb. That's something different. Here I'm talking about the fact that in this sentence, the subject is the thing that's performing this action which the vase is receiving. Subject, verb, and object. Active voice. Moreover, the verb matches the subject. And we can see that even more clearly if we put this in the present tense, which we'll see in a few minutes. Now, let's switch this around. We all know the way to reverse this in case we didn't want to admit that I'm the person who broke the vase. We can say, the vase was broken. The vase was broken. By whom? By me, but I'm not telling. You don't tell either. Notice how we form the passive voice. We use the past participle of the verb. I'm using a strong verb here, one of the so-called irregulars, because the participles are distinctive with their en endings. And we use a form of be. Whichever form of be matches our tense, aspect, and person here. Now, the most important thing to notice about how the sentence is rearranged syntactically is that the direct object is still receiving the action conceptually. It's still the recipient of the action, but it's the grammatical subject of the passive verb. And we can verify that it's the grammatical subject by pluralizing it and watching what happens to the verb. The vases were broken is necessary. The vases are the grammatical subject of a passive voice verb. Notice a couple of things that happen here. We have to rearrange the sentence. We build the passive verb out of the past participle plus to be as the auxiliary. And to be is the part of our main verb that carries all the signs of tense, aspect, and person. Voice is not tense. We can use the passive voice with any tense or aspect we want, and we can even use modal verbs. Plans are made, plans were made, plans were being made, plans should have been being made. In every case, we have our be auxiliary plus our past participle. Oh, sorry. Now, Brea and most prescriptive grammar books will point out that be is the necessary auxiliary verb to form the passive tense together with a past participle. But in fact, it's not always that way. We can recognize that this sentence, the car was wrecked, is idiomatic and normal. Let's punctuated. But we also know that we're used to hearing this. The car got wrecked. In fact, in colloquial speech, we often use get or got as the auxiliary that works together with the past participle to make the passive voice. And we even use it together. In fact, it's perfectly idiomatic in certain situations. If we used was in here, it simply wouldn't mean the same thing. We can switch between the two freely in everyday speech, even if we might prefer this one most of the time in informal writing. We do use got sometimes, though, in order to signify the suddenness of an action. There's a difference between the milk was drunk by somebody and the milk got drunk at some moment in time by somebody. And then, of course, we get down to this other sentence, which is rather different in its meaning and its operation. Everybody knows that this drunk doesn't mean the same thing as that drunk. And this creates some interesting ambiguity for us. Got shades slowly into a linking verb. This is definitely a participle. This appears to be a grammatical participle. This may be an adjective using got as a linking verb, or it may be a grammatical participle with a different meaning for the verb. I think the case is a little harder to make there, but really, why split the hair? Notice that the relationship between linking verb and a participle working as an adjective and auxiliary verb and participle forming the passive voice is a little bit of a difficult one to unpack. And as usual, there's a fuzzy boundary. But remember this, got is often an informal auxiliary that we use to create the passive voice, and we also use the got or the get auxiliary in the passive voice when we want to emphasize the suddenness of an action. It's not just got that shades, or get and got, that shade into linking verb from passive auxiliary to, though. Passive auxiliary? Probably not. Passive auxiliary? Likely, especially if we've got some modifiers to the verb group over here. Passive auxiliary? Definitely. So, the moral of the story, the prototypical passive auxiliary is be. But we often use get, got as the passive auxiliary when we're speaking informally, when we want to emphasize the suddenness or the completeness of a passive action, or in certain cases where it's especially associated with the meaning of the verb in its passive use.